In Texas, we live by a simple code. Never pick a fight you're not prepared to finish. So when some pushy, self-important HOA president, fresh out of college it seemed, tried to tell me I couldn't drill a well smack dab in the heart of the land. My family has owned for 5 generations. That wasn't just ignorance. That was professional suicide. I'm Clay Maddox. I hold the full water rights, backed by legal documents so old my grandfather drafted them on a manual typewriter. And I know every single pipe and line running under this ranch. She thought a few lines in some ridiculous rule book could override legitimate, long-standing land use rights. Tough luck for her, because 24 hours later the sheep started bleeding. The community water tanks ran dry, and the entire Meadowbrook HOA office went silent as a grave. Where are you folks watching from? Drop a comment below. Because this ain't just a tale about a well. This is about settling a score without firing a shot. Just a valve turned tight. And to my mind, that's the definition of a Texas victory. The sun was already high and beating down hard. When I heard the sound of tires crunching on the gravel drive, I was shoulder deep inside the workings of our old water pump, trying to squeeze another year out of equipment that was running before my daughter, Sage, was even born. The ranch had been too quiet since Sarah passed away 3 years ago. Just me and my 16-year-old girl, holding on to the legacy of 5 generations of Maddoxes. The land stretched out in front of us like a worn patchwork quilt, shades of brown and green stitched together by fence lines and the irrigation ditches my great-grandfather dug by hand. This wasn't just dirt and grass to us. This was home, history, and the hope of the future, all wrapped up in one dusty package. When I finally looked up from the pump, wiping black grease from my hands with an old shop rag, I saw a woman in a sharp business suit picking her way across the yard like she was navigating a minefield. "Mr. Maddox?" Her voice had that particular, practiced tone of command that people use when they've never actually had to earn any real authority. She was young, maybe late 20s, with perfectly coiffed, blonde hair that probably cost more than I spent on livestock feed in a month. "I'm Brittany Ashford, president of the Meadowbrook Homeowners Association. I need to discuss some environmental concerns regarding your property." She handed me an official-looking paper with a flourish that suggested she'd rehearsed the moment in front of a mirror. The letterhead was over-the-top fancy, all gold lettering and elaborate fonts. But the words themselves sent my blood pressure soaring faster than a spooked horse. "Effective immediately," I read aloud. "All drilling operations on properties within the association boundaries are suspended, pending environmental impact assessment." I read it again, then looked up at this slip of a girl who thought she could just stroll onto land that had been in my family since before her own grandparents were born. "Ma'am," I said, keeping my voice low and even, just like Sarah used to remind me when I dealt with stubborn people. "This ranch has been drilling wells since 1923. We hold water rights that predate most of the buildings in this entire county." Brittany's smile didn't waver, but a cold, hard glint appeared in her eyes. "The association has very clear environmental protection guidelines, Mr. Maddox. Unauthorized drilling could contaminate the aquifer that serves our entire community. We're simply being responsible stewards of our shared resources." The way she put emphasis on "our" made my jaw clench. She stood there, looking like a little mockingbird in an expensive suit, chirping shrilly, and thinking it could intimidate an eagle that had weathered 1,000 storms. What she didn't know was that the Maddox family had been stewards of this land, long before there was any association, before there were environmental guidelines, before there were people like her who mistook a fancy title for actual authority. I walked over to the main water valve, a piece of heavy hardware that had been the lifeblood of this ranch for longer than I could remember. My grandfather himself had installed it, laying pipes across property lines back, when neighbors were neighbors and a handshake. Agreement meant something. The valve was solid brass, worn smooth by decades of Texas sun and rain, and it controlled not just our water supply, but a lot more than I think anyone realized. "You seem to know a lot about our shared resources," I said, running my hand along the pipe disappearing into the ground. "Tell me, Miss Ashford, what exactly do you know about the infrastructure that actually brings water to your little community?" For just a second, her confidence flickered like a candle catching a breeze. "I'm sure the municipal systems are all properly regulated and documented." She stammered slightly. That's when I knew She had absolutely no idea what she was messing with. This wasn't just about a well or environmental protection. This was about power, pure and simple. And she had just picked the absolute wrong person to try and push around. "Here's what's going to happen," Brittany continued, her voice regaining that manufactured authoritative tone. "You will cease all drilling operations immediately, or the association will pursue legal action for violations of community environmental standards. We have lawyers, Mr. Maddox, and we are not afraid to use them." She turned sharply on her heel and started picking her way back across the yard, leaving me standing there with a piece of paper that felt less like a notice and more like a declaration of war. I watched her struggle across the uneven ground in those ridiculous high heels, and I couldn't help but remember the stories my grandfather used to tell. Stories about neighbors helping neighbors, not threatening them. Times when a man's word was his bond, and community meant looking out for each other, not looking for ways to control each other. But that was before people like Brittany Ashford showed up, armed with regulations, lawyers, and an overinflated sense of their own importance. As her car disappeared down the gravel drive, kicking up a cloud of dust that hung heavy in the still air, I looked down at the document in my hands, then back at the old brass valve beside me. Sage came out of the house just then, her long brown hair pulled back in a messy bun, her jeans already dusty from morning chores. She took one look at my face and knew instantly that something was wrong. "Dad, what's going on?" I handed her the letter and watched her expression change as she read it. At 16, Sage had inherited her mother's sharp mind and her grandfather's stubborn streak, a combination that made her surprisingly formidable despite her age. "She can't do this, can she?" she asked, her voice tight. But there was something Brittany Ashford didn't know about the Maddox family. We never back down, and we always have a plan B. The question wasn't if we would fight back. The question was how hard she wanted to push, before she found out exactly what that looked like. That evening, Sage and I climbed up to the attic, a dusty treasure trove of family history that smelled of old leather and faded memories. Boxes were stacked along the walls, each one labeled in my grandfather's neat, careful handwriting with dates that went back to when this land was still considered frontier territory. Sarah used to joke that we kept enough paperwork up here to start our own library, but she understood the importance of documentation in a family that had built its legacy one deed and contract at a time. The wooden floorboards creaked under our weight as we made our way to the section where my grandfather had stored all the water rights documents, a collection that had grown thicker with each passing generation. Sage pulled out her phone flashlight to help, supplementing the single bare bulb that hung from a rafter, casting long, dancing shadows on the walls as we searched through decades of legal history. "Here," she said, lifting a heavy folder bound with string that had gone soft with age. "Water rights and easements, 1920 to 1950. The contract we were specifically looking for was near the bottom of the stack. A water supply agreement, dated the 15th of March, 1923, signed by my great-grandfather Josiah Maddox and the County Water Authority. The language was formal and precise, establishing not just our right to drill wells on the property, but our obligation to provide water access to surrounding properties in exchange for easement rights across them. Signed a supply contract," I read aloud, translating the old legal language for Sage. "That doesn't mean they get to steal it." The document was crystal clear. The Maddox Ranch was not just a user of the local water system, but a key component of it, with pipes running from our wells to service the entire area that now called itself the Meadowbrook community. What Brittany Ashford didn't know was that her precious HOA was built on land that depended entirely on infrastructure my family had installed and maintained for nearly a century. The irony was so thick you could cut it with a butter knife. Here she was, threatening to shut down the very wells that had been supplying her community since before her parents were born. "Dad," Sage said, her voice carrying that familiar mix of excitement and mischief that reminded me so much of her mother. "I think she just kicked the wrong hornet's nest." We spent the next hour cross-referencing property lines and deed records, building a clear picture of just how interconnected our ranch was with the surrounding area. The modern subdivision that housed Brittany's HOA sat on land that had been sold off by my grandfather in the 1970s, but the water rights had remained with the original property under a series of agreements that seemed to have been forgotten by everyone except us. As we dug deeper into the documents, a more troubling picture began to emerge. The Meadowbrook Homeowners Association, according to the county records Sage pulled up on her laptop, had never been properly registered as a legal entity. Their bylaws, their environmental regulations, their threats of legal action, all of it was built on a foundation that wouldn't hold up under any serious legal scrutiny. "This is either the most incompetent legal work I've ever seen," I told Sage, "or someone is running a very elaborate con game." I decided to call Earl Patterson, our neighbor to the south who had been around almost as long as the fence posts. Earl was the kind of man who remembered when things were different, when neighbors looked out for each other instead of looking for ways to sue each other. His voice was gravelly from decades of cigarettes and dust, but his memory was sharp as a tack. "Clay boy, I was wondering when you'd call about that little blonde firecracker," he said before I could even explain why I was calling. "She came by here last week, trying to tell me I couldn't repair my windmill without filing some kind of environmental impact report. I told her where she could file her report, if you catch my meaning." Early went on to describe visits from Brittany to at least 6 other neighbors, each time with similar demands and veiled threats, each time targeting improvements or maintenance that had been routine for decades. "She's got some kind of agenda, Clay. This ain't about the environment. This is about control." As I hung up the phone, Sage was already pulling up more information on her laptop, her fingers flying across the keyboard with the kind of digital fluency that always made me feel old. "Dad, look at this," she said, turning the screen toward me. The land records show a series of recent purchases in the area, all by something called Meadowbrook Development, LLC, and guess who's listed as the principal agent? The name on the screen made everything click into place. Brittany Ashford. This wasn't about environmental protection or community standards. This was about land acquisition, and she was using the HOA as a weapon to pressure longtime residents into selling their properties. The scope of her ambition was becoming chillingly clear, and it was bigger than just my well or Earl's windmill. She was systematically targeting every property owner in the area, using intimidation and the threat of legal action to create an atmosphere of uncertainty and fear. But she had made one crucial, monumental mistake. She had started a fight with someone who knew the land, knew the law, and knew the immeasurable value of family legacy. When I traced the water lines from our ranch to the surrounding properties on the old survey maps, I discovered something that made me want to laugh and get angry at the exact same time. The entire Meadowbrook community, including Brittany's own house, was connected to the main water line that ran directly from our ranch's primary well. Every drop of water that flowed through their taps, every gallon that filled their swimming pools, every bit of irrigation that kept their lawns green in the brutal Texas heat, all of it came from infrastructure that my family had built and maintained for nearly a century. She wasn't just threatening to shut down my well, she was threatening to shut down the source of her own water supply. The woman who claimed to be protecting the community's shared resources didn't even understand what those resources were or where they came from. "Sage," I said, looking up from the map spread across the kitchen table, "I think our Miss Ashford just made the biggest mistake of her short but very ambitious career." But when I followed the water lines from the ranch to the HOA area on the detailed survey maps, I discovered something that made me want to laugh and be furious at the same time. The next morning brought a new kind of attack, one that didn't come through official letters or face-to-face confrontations, but through the relentless, impersonal machinery of social media. Sage found it first, scrolling through her phone over breakfast, and suddenly choking on her orange juice. "Dad, you need to see this," she said, turning her screen toward me with a mixture of disbelief and raw anger in her voice. Brittany had posted a video on TikTok that already had thousands of views and hundreds of comments. In it, she stood in front of what looked suspiciously like our ranch gate, though the angle was carefully chosen to make the property look as industrial and threatening as possible. "Environmental terrorists in our own backyard," she said to the camera, her voice dripping with a righteous indignation that would have been almost impressive if it weren't so completely manufactured. Local rancher Clay Maddox is planning to drill new wells that could contaminate our water supply and destroy the delicate ecosystem we've worked so hard to protect. The video was professionally shot and edited, complete with dramatic music and scary sounding statistics about groundwater, contamination that had absolutely nothing to do with our actual situation, but sounded alarming enough to grab people's attention. Within hours, the hashtag #SaveOurWater was trending locally, and my phone was buzzing with calls from reporters and genuinely concerned citizens who had been fed a steady diet of misinformation about my family's ranch. The comment section under Brittany's video was a toxic mix of armchair, environmentalism and mob mentality, with people calling for everything from immediate legal action to direct confrontation. Someone had even posted a picture of our front gate with the suggestion that concerned citizens should monitor the situation to make sure we didn't proceed with our illegal drilling operation. It was a masterful piece of manipulation, taking legitimate environmental concerns and weaponizing them against a family that had been practicing sustainable ranching for nearly a century. The irony was so thick it could choke a horse. Here was a woman who didn't even understand the basic infrastructure of her own community, accusing us of environmental terrorism, while she herself was planning to pave over pastures and potentially destroy the very water system that kept her precious HOA functioning. But Sage, bless her heart, had inherited more than just her mother's brains. She had also inherited her grandfather's talent for investigation and her grandmother's almost supernatural nose for detecting BS from a mile away. While I was dealing with angry phone calls and trying to explain to reporters why a family with a century-long history of water stewardship was not, in fact, planning to poison the local aquifer, Sage was doing what 16-year-olds do best, diving deep into the digital rabbit hole. "Dad," she said, looking up from her laptop with the kind of expression that meant she'd found something truly significant. "You're going to want to see this." She had traced Brittany's recent land purchases, cross-referenced them with the timeline of her HOA activities, and discovered a pattern that painted a very different picture of our self-appointed environmental protector. Not only had Brittany purchased 3 properties in the area over the past 6 months, but she had also filed preliminary development plans with the county for a luxury housing complex that would require massive water infrastructure improvements. The pieces were falling into place like dominoes in a carefully planned sequence. Brittany wasn't trying to protect the environment. She was trying to control it, positioning herself as the gatekeeper of development in an area that was clearly ripe for gentrification. By using environmental concerns as a weapon against longtime residents, she could pressure them into selling their properties at below-market prices, then turn around and develop those same properties under the deceptive banner of sustainable community planning. It was a brilliant scam. If you could overlook the complete lack of ethics and the lives it would destroy in the process. The HOA wasn't a community organization. It was a front for a land grab, and every regulation, every threat, every environmental concern was just another tool in her arsenal of manipulation and intimidation. She had created a false crisis to solve a real problem: how to acquire valuable land without paying fair market value for it. That afternoon, while Brittany's social media campaign continued to rage across the internet like a wildfire, fed by ignorance and outrage, I took a walk across the ranch to the main water line. The pipes ran underground for most of their length, but there were access points and valve housings that told the story of nearly a century of water management. Each generation of Maddox men had added to and improved the system, expanding capacity and improving efficiency, all while maintaining the delicate balance between conservation and community service. The bitter irony of the situation wasn't lost on me as I stood there in the Texas heat, looking at infrastructure that had been serving these communities since before Brittany was born. She was using environmental protection as a rallying cry while planning to pave over pastures and replace sustainable ranching with suburban sprawl that would strain water resources to the breaking point. The woman who accused us of being environmental terrorists was the one planning to destroy the very ecosystem she claimed to defend. By evening, the first of our actual neighbors started showing up at the ranch, not with pitchforks and angry demands, but with empty water containers and apologetic expressions. The social media storm had created an atmosphere of uncertainty that was affecting the entire community, and some folks were starting to worry about their water supply. "Clay," said Mrs. Henderson from down the road, "I don't know what all this fuss is about, but my well's been running low lately. and I was wondering if you might spare a few gallons until I can get it looked at. I helped her fill her containers from our backup supply, and as I did, I realized that this was exactly what Brittany wanted: confusion, fear, and neighbors turning against neighbors. But she had underestimated the power of community, relationships that had been built over decades, rather than manufactured over social media. In the digital age, a TikTok video can spread faster than gossip at the local barbershop. But the truth moves slower, and it burns longer. That night, as I sat on the porch listening to the familiar sounds of the ranch, settling in for the evening, I decided it was time to show Miss Ashford what happens when a real Texan decides to fight back. I knew exactly what needed to be done. That night, sleep came in fits and starts, interrupted by the weight of decisions that felt too big for one man to make alone. I found myself sitting at the kitchen table at 2 in the morning, staring at a photograph of Sarah that I kept next to the coffee maker. In the picture, she was laughing at something Sage had said, her eyes bright with the kind of pure joy that had made our little family feel complete. The silence of the house seemed to amplify every creak and settling sound, creating a symphony of solitude that had become too familiar since her passing. I don't know if I should keep fighting this. Sarah, I whispered to the photograph, feeling foolish but needing to voice the doubts that had been gnawing at me. What if she's right? What if I'm just a stubborn old rancher who doesn't understand the modern world? The questions hung in the air like smoke, and for a moment, I almost convinced myself that maybe it would be easier to just give in and avoid the conflict. The sound of bare feet on hardwood floors broke through my late-night pity party, and I looked up to see Sage padding into the kitchen, wearing an old t-shirt and bedhead that only teenagers can make look adorable. She took one look at me sitting there with the photograph and understood immediately what was happening. Without saying a word, she walked over to the refrigerator, poured 2 glasses of milk, and sat down across from me. "Can't sleep either?" she asked, her voice soft but carrying that familiar undertone of steel that reminded me so much of her mother. I nodded, not trusting myself to speak, without revealing just how close I was to throwing in the towel. "Dad," Sage said, leaning forward with an intensity that matched her gaze. "If Mom were still alive, she wouldn't let you quit now. She'd remind you that we've never backed down from bullies, and she wouldn't want you to start now, just because this bully has a fancy suit and a social media account. But what if I'm wrong, Sage? What if I'm just an old man trying to hold on to the past, while the world moves forward without me?" The words came out more vulnerable than I intended, revealing fears that I'd been carrying since Sarah's death about my ability to navigate this new world alone. Sage reached across the table and put her hand over mine, her touch warm and reassuring. "Dad, you're not holding on to the past. You're protecting the future. Our future. The future of this land. The future of everyone who depends on the water system you've been maintaining for years." Her voice grew stronger as she spoke, carrying the conviction of someone who had inherited not just land and water rights, but the immense responsibility that came with them. If you back down now, if you let someone like Brittany Ashford win just because she's loud and persistent, then I'll grow up thinking that good people always have to lose to bad people who are willing to fight dirty. The blunt truth in her words hit me like a physical blow, cutting through the self-doubt and fear that had been clouding my judgment. This wasn't just about water rights or property boundaries. This was about the kind of world we were going to leave for the next generation, about whether principles and integrity could still win in a society that seemed increasingly dominated by whoever could shout the loudest. Sage was right. And more than that, she was channeling the voice of her mother, the woman who had taught us both that sometimes the hardest thing and the right thing are the same. "If you quit now," Sage continued, her eyes bright with unshed tears, "what does that teach me about standing up for what's right? What does it teach me about family legacy and taking care of the land and the people who depend on it?" I looked at my daughter, really looked at her, and saw not just the 16-year-old girl who still needed her father's protection, but the young woman who would inherit all of this someday. She deserved better than a father who gave up when things got difficult. "You're right," I said, feeling something solid and determined, settling in my chest like a foundation stone. "Your mother would kick my ass from here to Sunday if she knew I was even thinking about backing down." Sage smiled then, The first real smile I'd seen from her since this whole mess started. And I realized that my moment of weakness had strengthened both of us. Sometimes you need to voice your doubts before you can find your courage. And sometimes you need someone who loves you to remind you who you are. We spent the next hour planning, really planning, not just reacting to Brittany's attacks, but developing a proactive strategy that would expose her lies and protect our family's rights. Sage pulled up county records and cross-referenced water permits while I reviewed the technical specifications of our well system and the legal documents that established our obligations and authorities. By the time the sun started to creep over the horizon, we had a clear picture of exactly what we were dealing with. The HOA was indeed using our main water line without proper authorization, and Marcus Webb's legal. Threats were built on a foundation of fraudulent documentation. "Dad," Sage said as we finally started cleaning up. The papers scattered across the kitchen table. "Tomorrow you're going to show everyone in this county what a real Texan looks like when he decides to fight back." The next morning dawned clear and bright, with the kind of crisp air that made you grateful to be alive and living in Texas. As I walked out to the main water valve, I carried myself differently than I had the day before. This wasn't about revenge or anger. This was about demonstrating the difference between real authority and manufactured power. My phone rang just as I reached the valve housing. Marcus Webb's name appeared on the screen. "Mr. Maddox, this is Marcus Webb. I represent the Meadowbrook Homeowners Association, and I'm calling to inform you that we're prepared to pursue immediate legal action if you don't comply with our environmental protection requirements." His voice carried the kind of slick, legal arrogance that made my decision even easier. I listened to his threats while running my hand along the solid brass valve that controlled so much more than just water pressure. "Mr. Webb," I said when he finally paused, "you might want to check your facts before you start making threats. But don't worry, you'll have plenty of opportunity to do that soon enough." As I hung up the phone, I realized that Brittany and her lawyer had just handed me the perfect reason to demonstrate. What happens when you threaten someone who understands how infrastructure works? Standing there next to the valve that had been serving this community for decades, I knew exactly what needed to be done. This wasn't about revenge. This was about closing one valve to open up the truth. The decision to take action came with the morning coffee and the kind of clarity that only arrives after a sleepless night spent wrestling with your conscience and winning. I set up my phone on the hood of my truck, angled it to capture both me and the main water valve, and started a Facebook live stream that would change everything. "Good morning, folks," I said to the camera, my voice carrying the kind of calm authority that comes from knowing you're absolutely in the right. "I'm Clay Maddox, and I'm standing here on land that's been in my family for 5 generations, next to water infrastructure that's been serving this community since 1923, pulled out the original water supply contract, holding it up to the camera so people could see the official seals and signatures. This document doesn't just give us the right to drill wells. It establishes our responsibility to provide water access to surrounding areas through infrastructure that we built, maintain, and pay for." I walked the camera along the main water line, showing the access points and valve housings that told the story of nearly a century of community service. What Miss Brittany Ashford doesn't understand is that her precious HOA community has been drinking Maddox well water since before she was born. Every drop that comes out of their taps flows through pipes that run from right here. Now, Miss Ashford claims to be protecting our shared resources from environmental terrorism. I continued, my hand resting on the main valve handle. But she's planning to develop this entire area, paving over pastures and replacing sustainable ranching with suburban sprawl. She's not an environmentalist. She's a developer, using environmental concerns as a weapon to intimidate longtime residents into selling their land at below-market prices. The comment section was exploding with outrage from people who were finally understanding the scope of Brittany's deception. Residents who had been pressured by the HOA were sharing their own stories, creating a real-time chorus of voices that exposed her pattern of intimidation. "So I want everyone to understand what's about to happen," I said, looking directly into the camera. "This isn't about revenge or anger or teaching someone a lesson. This is about closing one valve to open up the truth." The brass handle turned with the kind of solid resistance that spoke to decades of reliable operation, and the sound it made when it reached the fully closed Position was like a judge's gavel, falling in a courtroom. "There," I said, dusting off my hands with satisfaction. "Miss Ashford wants to talk about shared resources and environmental protection? Well, now she can experience firsthand what happens when those resources are controlled by someone who understands their value." I explained to the viewers that the valve I had just closed controlled the main water line, serving the entire Meadowbrook community, and that according to our legal water supply agreement, we had every legal right to suspend service when dealing with customers who were threatening our operations. The live stream continued for another 20 minutes, with me answering questions and providing historical context about water rights that most people had never considered. The viewer count climbed steadily as people shared the stream, and I could see that the narrative was finally shifting. The water will be restored when the illegal HOA is dissolved and Miss Ashford stops her intimidation campaign, I announced before ending the stream. Until then, she can explain to her neighbors why their environmental protector managed to leave them without water. 24 hours later, the consequences of my action became impossible to ignore. The miniature sheep that Brittany had installed in the HOA's decorative garden area, part of her pastoral aesthetic community beautification project, had begun screaming with the kind of desperate intensity that only comes from genuine thirst. The sound carried across the neighborhood like an air raid siren, a constant, pathetic reminder that the community's water supply had been turned off at its source. The storage tanks that served the Meadowbrook community were running dry, and residents who had been posting angry comments about environmental terrorism were now dealing with the stark reality of empty taps and unfilled swimming pools. Phone calls to the municipal water department revealed what I'd already explained in my live stream. The HOA area was served by private infrastructure, not public utilities, and the owner of that infrastructure had every legal right to control its operation. The HOA office, which had been buzzing with activity and righteous indignation just days before, had gone silent as a tomb, with no one willing to answer phones or respond to the growing chorus of complaints from water-deprived residents. The sound of those sheep became the soundtrack to Brittany's downfall, a bleating chorus that grew more desperate with each passing hour. Neighbors who had been swept up in her environmental protection campaign were now demanding answers about why their environmental protector hadn't mentioned that she was planning to cut off their water supply in the process of saving it. Local news crews arrived to cover the story, drawn by the potent combination of social media, drama, and the surreal spectacle of suburban sheep screaming for water in what was supposed to be an environmentally conscious community. The optics couldn't have been worse for Brittany. Here she was, the self-appointed defender of community resources, presiding over a neighborhood where domestic animals were suffering from thirst because of her ill-conceived power play. Every bleat from those sheep was like a nail being hammered into the coffin of her credibility, and every hour that passed without water service was another brutal reminder that she had picked a fight with someone who understood exactly how infrastructure works. The calls started coming in from HOA residents almost immediately, but they weren't directed at me. They were directed at Brittany, demanding to know why their environmental champion had managed to leave them high and dry in her misguided quest to save them from imaginary threats. Earl called to tell me, "I think you just turned Miss Ashford's environmental protection campaign into a water conservation demonstration. Those sheep of hers are singing the blues, and her neighbors are starting to ask some very uncomfortable questions." And right as the sound of those desperate sheep echoed across the neighborhood, like a chorus demanding justice, my phone rang. Unknown number. When I answered, the voice on the other end made my blood run cold, but for all the wrong reasons. Marcus Webb arrived at the ranch the next morning, driving a black sedan and wearing a suit that probably cost more than most people made in a month. "Mr. Maddox," he said, approaching with a confident, purposeful stride. "I'm Marcus Webb, legal counsel for the Meadowbrook Homeowners Association. I have a temporary restraining order requiring you to immediately restore water service to the community." He handed me a document, clearly expecting me to fold at the first sign of legal pressure. What he didn't expect was for me to smile while the sound of sheep bleating provided an almost comical soundtrack to his serious legal presentation. "That's an interesting document, Mr. Webb. I said, taking my time to read through the legalese. But how does a homeowners association that was never properly registered with the county manage to obtain a restraining order? His confidence flickered visibly. And then Sage appeared, carrying her laptop with the kind of expression that meant deep trouble for him. "Mr. Webb," she said with a sweet, innocent smile, "the association's legal standing is very much in question." She paused for effect. "Brittany is your sister-in-law, isn't she? And you helped her file fraudulent papers to establish the HOA. Marcus's face went through several rapid color changes as he realized. His family connection had been discovered and exposed. "But fraud goes deep," said Earl Patterson, arriving with perfect timing and carrying a cardboard box full of documents. "Found these in my storage shed. Turns out my daddy kept copies of all the subdivision. Paperwork from the 70s. The documents told a story that made Marcus's restraining order look utterly worthless. Not only had the Meadowbrook development been established without proper water rights transfers, but the original agreement specifically stated that water service would remain under ranch control. Your sister-in-law didn't just establish an illegal HOA," I said, enjoying the way his expensive composure was cracking. "She's been running a systematic fraud to pressure residents into selling, so she can develop the area herself." Earl's box contained more than just subdivision records. At the bottom was a 1978 geological survey, identifying a massive underground aquifer beneath the Meadowbrook area, commissioned by a development company that had abandoned the project when regulations made large-scale water extraction unfeasible. "This is what she's after," I said, holding up the survey for Sage's live stream camera. "Brittany knew about this aquifer and has been systematically acquiring properties to claim millions of dollars worth of water rights. Every environmental argument has been part of a calculated plan to control community resources for private profit." The press conference that followed drew local news crews and investigative journalists to our ranch. I stood in front of the main water valve, with the desperate sheep providing the perfect, poignant soundtrack, and laid out Brittany's deception for an audience, extending far beyond our county lines. "This is what happens when people with hidden agendas use legitimate concerns as weapons," I said to the cameras. "Environmental protection becomes exploitation. Community safety becomes intimidation." The sound of sheep bleating in the background added an almost surreal quality to the legal drama unfolding on camera, with viewers posting comments faster than anyone could possibly read them, just as I was explaining the geological survey's implications for Brittany's development plans. Two police cars pulled into the ranch driveway, followed by a sedan carrying what looked like federal investigators. Brittany Ashford stepped out of the lead police car, her usual composed demeanor replaced by the kind of raw panic that comes from watching a carefully constructed house of cards collapse in real time. But instead of arresting me for water theft or environmental terrorism, the officers placed Brittany in handcuffs while reading her rights on charges that included fraud, conspiracy, and illegal use of government authority. The timing couldn't have been more perfect if we had scripted it ourselves. Just as the truth about her development scam was being broadcast to thousands of viewers, she was being arrested for the very crimes that her HOA activities had been designed to conceal. The sound of sheep bleating in the background gradually faded as I walked over to the main water valve and turned it back to the open position, and the silence that followed was like a collective sigh of relief from both the animals and the community they had inadvertently helped to save. Marcus Webb stood frozen beside his expensive car, watching his sister-in-law being led away in handcuffs, while the evidence of their fraud was being broadcast live to thousands of viewers. The geological survey in my hands represented millions of dollars in water rights that Brittany had tried to steal through intimidation and legal manipulation. And now it would become key evidence in what promised to be a very public trial. "Mr. Webb," I said, walking over to where he stood looking like a man who had just watched his entire career evaporate, "you might want to start looking for a new line of work. Something tells me the State Bar Association is going to have some very pointed questions about your professional conduct." The press conference continued for another hour, with reporters asking detailed questions about water rights, environmental fraud, and the systematic intimidation campaign that Brittany and Marcus had been running against residents. Every answer I gave was supported by documents from Earl's box, recordings from Sage's phone, and the geological survey that revealed the true scope of Brittany's ambitions. This case represents everything that's wrong with using environmental protection as a cover for corporate greed, said one of the investigating officers. These people weren't trying to save the environment. They were trying to steal it. As the last news van pulled out of our driveway and the sun began to set over the ranch, I stood next to the main water valve and listened to the sounds of a community slowly returning to normal. The sheep had stopped their desperate bleating, replaced by the contented sounds of animals that had access to fresh water again. Phone calls were already coming in from grateful neighbors who had watched the entire drama unfold on social media and were finally understanding what had been happening in their community. But there was one more surprise waiting for us, something that would tie together all the loose ends of this strange and twisted story. The documentary that Sage had been secretly creating throughout the entire ordeal premiered 3 months later at the county courthouse, drawing an audience that included everyone from environmental law professors to investigative journalists who specialized in exposing municipal corruption. What none of us had realized, not even me, was that my 16-year-old daughter had been documenting every single step of Brittany's deception and our response to it, creating a comprehensive record that would serve as both historical documentation and irrefutable legal evidence. I started recording everything the day she first showed up at the ranch, Sage explained to the packed courthouse auditorium. Her presentation, displaying a timeline that stretched from Brittany's initial threats through her arrest and the subsequent investigation. I knew something wasn't right about her story, and I wanted to make sure we had evidence of what happened, not just her version of events. The footage she had captured, combined with the legal documents Earl had preserved and the geological survey that revealed Brittany's true motives, created a compelling, undeniable narrative about the difference between genuine environmental protection and environmental exploitation, disguised as community activism. The third time I touched the main water valve, it was to officially transfer operational control to the newly formed Meadowbrook Water Cooperative, a community-owned organization that would ensure transparent, responsible management of the area's water resources while maintaining the sustainable practices that had protected the aquifer for nearly a century. This valve has been the heart of our community's water system for generations, I said to the assembled neighbors, my hand resting on the brass fitting that had become a symbol of both conflict and resolution. Today it becomes a symbol of what we can accomplish when we work together instead of against each other, when we choose cooperation over intimidation, and when we put community welfare ahead of personal profit. The Meadowbrook Homeowners Association was officially dissolved by court order, its assets seized to compensate residents who had been defrauded by Brittany's development scheme. Marcus Webb lost his law license and was sentenced to community service that included teaching legal ethics seminars for continuing education programs, an irony that seemed particularly appropriate given his role in enabling his sister-in-law's fraud. The development company that had been secretly funding Brittany's land acquisition efforts was fined heavily and banned from operating in the county, sending a clear message that environmental protection laws were meant to protect communities, not provide cover for corporate exploitation. But perhaps the most satisfying outcome was the establishment of the Meadowbrook Environmental Education Center, built on land that Brittany had planned to turn into luxury housing and funded by the recovered proceeds from her development scam. Sage's documentary became required viewing for environmental law students across the state, and she was invited to speak at conferences about the role of social media in both creating and solving community conflict. Her presentation at the State High School Environmental Science Competition, titled Shared Resources and Community Responsibility, earned her a full scholarship to study environmental engineering with a focus on sustainable water management. I learned that protecting the environment isn't just about regulations and restrictions, she told the judges, her confidence and poise reminiscent of her mother at that age. It's about understanding systems and relationships, about building cooperation instead of conflict, and about making sure that the people who claim to be protecting our resources understand what they're protecting and why it matters. A year after Brittany's arrest, I was surprised to see a familiar figure approaching the ranch gate on foot, walking slowly and carrying herself with the kind of careful humility that comes from hard-earned wisdom. Brittany Ashford looked different than she had during her days as HOA president. Her expensive suits replaced by simple work clothes, and her aggressive confidence replaced by something that looked remarkably like genuine remorse. She had served her sentence and completed her community service, which included working with environmental restoration projects that had clearly taught her the difference between real conservation work and the political theater she had been performing. "Mr. Maddox," she said, her voice carrying none of the manufactured authority she had once wielded so carelessly. "I came to apologize and to ask if there might be a place for me in the work you're doing at the environmental center." She paused, looking toward the pasture where the sheep that had once screamed from thirst were now grazing contentedly in the shade of oak, trees that had been growing since before any of us were born. "I don't expect forgiveness," she continued, her voice quiet. "I know I caused a lot of pain and fear for people who didn't deserve it, but I'd like to try to make amends by doing the kind of environmental work I claimed to be doing before, the real kind that helps communities instead of exploiting them." There was a sincerity in her voice that I hadn't heard during her previous visits to the ranch, and I found myself remembering Sarah's deep-seated belief that people could truly change if they were willing to do the hard work of acknowledging their mistakes and learning from them. After a long moment of silence, broken only by the gentle lowing of cattle and the sound of wind through the grass, I nodded toward the environmental center, visible in the distance. "The center is always looking for volunteers who understand the difference between protecting the environment and using environmental concerns to hurt people," I said. "If you're serious about making amends, that might be a good place to start." In Texas, we have a saying, "Don't start a fight if you ain't got the strength to finish it." But I've learned that sometimes the best way to finish a fight isn't with a bigger hammer, but by showing everyone who's really standing on the side of what's right and just. I didn't close that water valve because of anger or revenge, but because sometimes you have to demonstrate the stark difference between real authority and manufactured power, between genuine environmental protection and environmental exploitation disguised as community service. The sound of those sheep, who had once screamed from thirst and were now bleating contentedly in green pastures, reminded me that sometimes the most important victories are the ones that teach us how to build something better from the wreckage of what came before. Every time I hear those sheep calling to each other across the pasture, every time I see neighbors working together at the water cooperative, every time I watch Sage explaining sustainable water management to visiting school groups, I'm reminded that sometimes a valve turned tight can say more than 1,000 words about justice, community, and the kind of world we want to leave for the next generation. Sometimes the most powerful weapon against injustice isn't violence or anger, but simply turning off the tap and letting the truth flow freely. Real strength comes from understanding our responsibilities to each other and to the land we share. Have you ever faced someone who used legitimate concerns as weapons against honest people? How did you respond? And what did you learn about real versus manufactured authority? Your experiences help build conversations that make us all stronger. If this story resonated with you, please like, subscribe, and share it with someone who believes that quiet strength can speak louder than noise. At Loop Stories, every story shared builds a world where truth doesn't have to shout to be heard. Keep supporting me and share. This video must subscribe for more videos. Thank you.